This program is intended for informational and educational purposes only. All views and opinions expressed are the views and opinions of the individuals and sponsors presenting them, and not the LTB network. Enjoy the show.
Welcome, and thanks for tuning in to another exciting edition of SovereignBTC, your guide to the practical side of everyday Bitcoin use. This is our 8th episode. You can hear us on letstalkbitcoin.com on their podcast feed. You can also find us at SovereignBTC.com, and I invite you to check out our podcast feed there. We're including all the individual excerpts from the podcast, and we also have some full-length speeches that I've recorded at the various Liberty conferences and Bitcoin conferences I've attended across the country. So there's a lot of great media tidbits for you to enjoy. We have a great program lined up for you today. On this week's edition, we bring you the Bitcoin news of the week, courtesy of the Liberty Beat. There's a lot happening in the Bitcoin space. We then cover the Bitmom, that's Catherine Bleich, a recently published article she had in Bitcoin Magazine titled The Currency of Compassion. It's all about how Bitcoin is amplifying the success of charity work all throughout the country. On a related note, we bring you just part of a recent interview from the Bitmom podcast series on women in Bitcoin, this time featuring MK Lords of Bitcoin Not Bombs and Sean's Outpost. The excerpt covers a couple questions related to Megan's work with Sean's Outpost, a Florida nonprofit that provides support to the homeless in the Pensacola area. Then we bring you a recording of an impromptu speech that I delivered at the Texas Bitcoin Conference. I was asked to introduce Jeffrey Tucker, and right as I was beginning, in comes conference organizer Paul Snow, who tells the crowd we have to delay for 10 minutes. So I pulled a 10-minute talk out of my rear end, telling why I find Bitcoin appealing and how excited I am that Bitcoin is essentially anarchy in action. Ended up being a pretty powerful little speech, and then I introduced good old Jeffrey Tucker. Next, we hit you with this week's quote of the week. It's from the alleged creator of Bitcoin, the infamous Dorian Nakamoto, who, if you ask me, just wants to be left alone. Finally, we leave you with the speech recorded at the Texas Bitcoin Conference by Dr. Robert Murphy. The speech is all about the consistencies and inconsistencies between Bitcoin and Austrian economics. Bob Murphy is an economics professor, so this one's a little wonky, but if you're up for a great learning experience, you won't want to miss it. I think it's an important conversation that needs to be had within the Bitcoin space. Thanks again for listening to the show. You can find us at SovereignBTC.com. You can like us on Facebook at Facebook.com/SovereignBTC, or you can follow us on Twitter at Twitter.com/SovBTC. Without further ado, folks, here's this week's Bitcoin News of the Week.
Thank you, John. I'm Brian Hagan, and in the news, the man outed by Newsweek as the creator of Bitcoin hires a lawyer and issues a statement denying his involvement with the cryptocurrency. Dorian Satoshi Nakamoto's statement, released March 17th by his lawyer, calls the magazine story a false report and says it's harmed his prospects for gainful employment. The statement further states the article has been the source of a great deal of confusion and stress. Nakamoto in the statement says this will be his final public comment on the matter and asks that his privacy be respected. The article by Newsweek has fallen under fire for alleged inaccuracies in its reporting. The magazine stands by its story.
Bitcoin version 0.90 was released this week. The new version includes fixes for the transaction malleability problem, multi-signature addresses, a lower network relay fee, and many protocol changes and optimizations.
200,000 Bitcoins have been found. That word in a statement posted by Mt. Gox on its website. The bankrupt exchange says the forgotten Bitcoins were found March 7th in an old format online wallet, long thought to have been empty. The coins were found when the wallet was checked following the company's bankruptcy filing. Reuters reports that Mt. Gox says it moved the 200,000 Bitcoins to offline wallets between March 14th and 15th for security reasons. Many of the company's 127,000 creditors are skeptical about what the company says happened to the Bitcoins. In the bankruptcy filing, Mt. Gox said $28 million was missing from its Japanese bank accounts.
On Sunday, March 16th, the nonprofit organization Free Aid, which operates entirely on Bitcoin donations, had close to 23.5 Bitcoins stolen from their wallet. While the organization did have two-factor authentication set up, it is reported that one of the email accounts for a Free Aid organizer was hacked, and the thief was able to reset the two-factor authentication and exploit it in order to gain access to their wallet. Free Aid has since updated their security measures and created new wallets and addresses to receive donations.
Earlier this week, blockchain.info, the wallet service in Blockchain Explorer, was down for over a day. The company was active in engaging blockchain users in the Bitcoin community, relaying constant updates on the status of the service. Blockchain representatives indicated that the problems were caused due to issues with their database software. As of this report, the data and wallet services have been completely restored.
KNC Miners now accepting pre-orders for its Titan script miner. The unit will cost just under $10,000 and is expected to deliver 100 millihash in mining power. Script miners are worried the release of this new hardware in quarter 2 or 3 will dramatically increase the difficulty of the altcoin networks, rendering GPU miners effectively obsolete for some coins.
And that's this week's Bitcoin News of the Week, courtesy of the Liberty Beat, your daily source for Liberty news and activist updates, online at thelibertybeat.com. Back to you, John.
Next, I want to just talk a little bit about an article that Catherine Bleich wrote. It was published on March 18th on Bitcoin Magazine. You can check it out at bitcoinmagazine.com. It's titled The Currency of Compassion at the Texas Bitcoin Conference. And my wife and I and our family attended the Texas Bitcoin Conference on March 5th and 6th. It was an incredible event. Amazing to meet with so many people, to hear from so many people. The networking opportunities were great. And the event featured just a whole slew of charities and charity work and opportunities to support these charities, among them Free Aid, Antiwar.com, Bitcoin Not Bombs, and Sean's Outpost. Also, Capital Area of Texas Food Bank was there. It's a mainstream food bank that supplies food to hundreds of thousands of families in Central Texas. They recently started accepting Bitcoin, which I think is a really good sign of the times. The article that Catherine wrote, essentially it's a narrative of her personal story and experience at the conference, and interwoven in the narrative is explorations of these different nonprofits and the work that they do. She also talks about the different events that took place during the conference. There was a charity luncheon that was hosted by the Bitcoin Belle, our good friend Michelle Seven. There was also a Bitcoincert, which was really exciting. The tickets were paid for entirely with Bitcoin, and all of the proceeds went to support the nonprofits that were represented at the conference. So I definitely want you to check out this article. It's called, again, The Currency of Compassion at the Texas Bitcoin Conference. It's rather lengthy and goes in depth about the great work that these nonprofits are doing and what you can do to get involved. And I think it paints a really good picture with Bitcoin. Of course, there's a lot of people that think Bitcoin is just a speculative investment tool that greedy people are using to get rich, when in reality, Bitcoin really is freeing people, and it's being used in order to help people that are in need. The charity implications for Bitcoin are huge. I'm really excited about the prospect of a nonprofit operating entirely on Bitcoin and then having the blockchain ledger be totally publicly viewable and encouraging people to check it out, to audit it. You see what comes in, what goes out. I think it's pretty exciting, the implications of the nonprofit sector merging with the Bitcoin ecosystem. Very promising, and there's a lot of organizations that are doing a lot of good work on that front. Speaking of one of those organizations, a couple of those organizations, Bitcoin Not Bombs and Sean's Outpost, they are very lucky to have MK Lords working with them. She is a diehard activist, liberty activist, and Bitcoin activist. She's got a lot of great stuff to say, and Catherine Bleich, a.k.a. the Bit Mom, recently sat down with her to chat about her experience in the Bitcoin world, women in Bitcoin, and the charities that she's helping out utilizing Bitcoin. This is part of the Women in Bitcoin podcast series that you can find at thebitmom.com. And we're just going to play a little excerpt here where Catherine chats with Megan about Sean's Outpost, the work they're doing, and some of the heat that they're facing from the county there in Florida. So without further ado, here's Catherine Bleich interviewing MK Lords as part of the Women in Bitcoin podcast series on thebitmom.com.
Now, you mentioned this growing homelessness problem here in our country and across the globe, and it's epic and it's scary. And, I think a lot of people are looking for solutions because it could be almost anyone. Middle income people have massive amounts of debt for their homes, and you could get laid off. There's all sorts of opportunity for failure when it comes to paying back what you owe on your house. And I know you're involved with an organization there in Pensacola. called Sean's Outpost, and I was hoping that you could sort of talk about them a little bit and what they are doing with Bitcoin to help this homelessness problem.
Yes, so I met Jason King about a year ago when I interviewed him for Bitcoin Not Bombs, and what he did is he started a homeless outreach organization that's entirely funded by Bitcoin. And the way it started was he found out that his best friend had been murdered, and he was trying to find a way to honor his memory. And it started out with this other homeless outreach group that was shutting down basically, and they would no longer be able to feed people. They were doing a meal a week. And Jason decided that he would kind of take that over, and it started off with, we're going to fill this void in the homeless outreach community by feeding people. And at this kind of around the same time, Bitcoin started skyrocketing, and it got up to $50 a Bitcoin. So he went on Reddit and he said, we can keep discussing and speculating about what this means for Bitcoin, but I'm telling you right now that one Bitcoin can feed 40 people. Send me your Bitcoins and I'll feed people. And that's exactly what he did. And he got so much support from the Bitcoin community that he is able to, the Sean's Outpost crew is able to feed people 6 days a week, almost every day. They've been able to purchase a 9-acre property that they're turning into a campground where the homeless people can stay safely, because it is illegal to be homeless in Pensacola now. They passed all of these ordinances banning homelessness, banning public camping, but basically it was to hide the growing homelessness problem. So he's been very successful at this. The main things that have gotten in the way have been, to no one's surprise, government. The county and the city have been trying to stop us. And right now, Jason is running across the country. He's doing Bitcoin Across America, which is raising awareness about homelessness and how Bitcoin can help the homeless. And he has a team here, Mike Kimbrell and Adam Richard, and his wife sometimes comes down, and they're running a thrift store, and they're delivering meals to these homeless camps. And the people, they have to be really secluded, because if they're caught camping, they'll be arrested. And it's gotten so bad that they're afraid of the police. The police are always harassing them. The code enforcement people a few months ago from the city actually stole blankets from homeless people when it was freezing weather outside. But thankfully, the Bitcoin community showed some action. We were able to get a bunch of blanket donations and got those distributed to people. We got all the blankets that were stolen replaced and got a stockpile of them for more people. So each time the city or the county, because we're dealing with two governments basically, and they sometimes work together and sometimes they fight each other, whatever. But every time they try to do something, we just get more and more support. Unfortunately, we'd rather just be left alone, because, we just want to do what we want to do. We want to help people. We want to have a safe place for them to go. Satoshi Forest is the name of the property, and it's private property. And what they're doing right now is they're trying to say, oh, well, you can't have people camping on your private property. So in a way, it's kind of interesting to see the people locally who've come out in support, because you have a very strong property rights appreciation in Pensacola. That is one positive side from kind of the far right elements, is they do have a very strong sense of property rights, whereas the left elements that are still fairly active in Pensacola too, they're very much concerned with the compassionate side, with the helping the homelessness side. So in a way, it's uniting two kind of opposing groups, for a common good. So I think that's really interesting, and that's kind of ongoing, that's developing, and we're kind of at odds right now with the county and city over a few things. But I think it's going to be something where we're going to persevere, and, each time they do something to us, they reveal themselves for who they are and their true nature, which is these evil authoritarian sociopaths.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. We've had homeless people here in Austin have their arms broken, been booted out of their tents. And I would really like to see something like Sean's Outpost happen here in Central Texas, because there's a great need for it. And I think in a lot of the coastal communities, southern communities where the weather's nicer, homeless people are drawn to come from other places here. I know when I lived in Santa Barbara, that was the case. Living in Austin, that's the case. So it really would be fantastic to see this replicated in other places. Are there, thoughts of that happening, or would Jason rather see people organically do it in their own communities themselves?
Yes, he's wanting to see Sean's Outpost spread, and he wants it set up eventually as a distributed autonomous organization where things would be where the accounting and where the funding would all be controlled by a blockchain. So you kind of avoid some of the maybe possibly bad human elements that sometimes get into charities, especially some of the larger charities. And actually at the charity luncheon at the Texas Bitcoin conference, he introduced a couple in Dallas who are starting a Sean's Outpost branch. So in Dallas, Texas, there's a couple who have decided that they're going to start their own Sean's Outpost. We have heard of people, I believe, in South Florida wanting to start one, and he does want to see it grow, and he does want people to, whether it's called Sean's Outpost or not, I think it doesn't really matter. He'd like to see more people getting involved and taking more proactive measures and using because what Bitcoin allows you to do is it allows you to completely do things through direct action. You get the funding, you're able to feed people. There's not, we have to have meetings about how to help people, or we're taking this government grant money that limits us to only this type of outreach. That's happened with some of the other charity organizations here. It allows you to cut the strings of government, because when you take money from the government in the form of grants, there's always strings attached, and you basically have to do things their way. Yes, they call it, the right way, but you have to do things their way. And we don't ask permission to do the right thing.
That was a great interview. If you want to hear the full interview, check it out at thebitmom.com. Again, it's part of the Women in Podcast series. You'll also find an interview with Dr. Stephanie Murphy of Free Aid and Let's Talk Bitcoin, as well as an interview with Megan Duffield of Amagi Metals, which is a precious metals broker that accepts Bitcoin, and they accept Litecoin and Dogecoin. That's really exciting. Next, we're going to play for you. It's about 12 minutes. It's a speech, an impromptu speech that I delivered to the crowd at the Texas Bitcoin Conference. I was asked to introduce Jeffrey Tucker, who is a good friend of mine. I'm a big fan of Jeffrey Tucker's work. So I was about to get up there and say my little piece about Jeffrey and how excited I am that he's a big Bitcoin fan and Bitcoin proselytizer. And in comes Paul Snow, one of the main organizers of the conference, to inform us that one of the luncheons went over and we need to kill 10 minutes. So what better thing to do in 10 minutes than run my mouth, which I really enjoy doing. And I got the opportunity to do just that. So I thought I'd share with people my experience with Bitcoin, how I heard about it, why I think it's so promising, and I decided to tie it into my love of the philosophy of liberty and anarchism. I truly believe that Bitcoin is an example of anarchism in action, and it demonstrates we do not need central or coercive institutions in order to solve our common problems or fulfill our wants and needs. It's just one of the things I highlighted in this little impromptu speech I wanted to share with you today on Sovereign BTC Podcast.
How's everybody doing this afternoon? Give it up for peace, freedom, and Bitcoin! That's one hell of a trifecta. My name's John Bush, and I came to check out Jeffrey and record audio, and I finagled my way into introducing the fine gentleman, best dressed man this side of the Mississippi. So there's a couple housekeeping notes. Housekeeping! You get that reference? There's a charity luncheon that there's still tickets for. I believe the charity luncheon's going to go to help fund Bitcoin Not Bombs, as well as Sean's Outpost, in addition to Free Aid and antiwar.com.
Guys, we're gonna delay like 10 minutes because the people eating in the charity luncheon, they're pigs. They're just pigs. We can't get them out. So I promised to put the the conference on hold for 10 minutes, okay? Please talk amongst yourselves or watch this guy as he stands with the microphone for 10 minutes, okay? Cool. Thank you. Entertain us, John.
All right. So scratch that last announcement there. The other announcement was, don't forget about the Coincert tonight. BitCoincert. How clever is that? 8:30 p.m. here. You don't have to go far. There'll be a reception between the end of the conference and the beginning of the conference in the exhibit hall. Then there will be a cash bar during the... Cash bar? Who uses cash these days? Come on. Well, since I have a microphone in my hand and we have 10 minutes to spare, maybe I'll talk a little bit. My name's John Bush. I'm an activist here in Central Texas. I've been involved in the pursuit of liberty for about 13 or 14 years now, and have a small family, 2 kiddos, my lovely wife, Catherine. We're actually working on a documentary reality show. It's called Sovereign Living, and coming up at 4:40 p.m., we'll be screening the 4th episode, which is all about Bitcoin. We filmed it up at the Porcupine Freedom Festival, which is part of New Hampshire's Free State Project. And we set up a wallet. We chat with Dr. Robert Murphy, who spoke yesterday. We chatted with Eric Voorhees of Coinapult, and he helped me set up one of my first Bitcoin wallets. So it's a wonderful example. We're trying to show, an other way of doing things that isn't dependent on centralized or coercive institutions, and it's fun, it's entertaining. So we're going to be screening that at 4:40. I'm really excited about Bitcoin. I've always had a few little obsessions, and for the past year or so, I've been extremely obsessed with Bitcoin, to the point where me and my wife always joke, randomly we'll just say Bitcoin, 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 Litecoin, Dogecoin. I added the embellishment there. But for me, Bitcoin just came natural. We've been pursuing this concept of sovereign living, which again is the idea that we ought not be dependent on centralized or coercive institutions for any different aspect of life, whether it's healthcare, whether it's defense. For example, I hold the opinion that we shouldn't rely on monopolistic police departments in order to keep people safe and keep security in the streets. We should protect each other. We should help one another. We should film the police. We should call out evildoers and those who would harm others or exploit others. We shouldn't rely on a monopolistic institution that actually ends up doing more harm than good. Likewise, when it comes to justice, we shouldn't rely on some monopoly court. We should go to arbitration, and we should take it upon ourselves in every aspect of our individual lives to try this, to live this lifestyle. It's my belief, if you're interested in creating a free society, raise your hand if you're interested in the pursuit of a free society. Yeah. If that's your goal, the most important thing you can do, in my opinion, is live your life in a manner that's consistent with the philosophy of liberty, which isn't always easy. Harry Brown wrote a book, How I Found Freedom in an Unfree World, and we always joke around, we call our show Sovereign Living, but unfortunately, by no means do I consider myself a genuine sovereign. The idea that no one holds any authority over my head. I am the highest authority in my life. I have a driver's license. I prefer not to have one. I don't like the idea that we have to ask permission in order to travel freely across this country or from state to state. I don't much appreciate that. I still file my income taxes every year. But there's wonderful write-offs you can take advantage of. But if I had my way, I would prefer not to do that. But the reason I do is because I'm afraid of what would happen if I didn't. And I think a lot of people live their life in a way based on fear. And that's okay, because there's men with guns, and if you don't comply with their edicts, they'll take your property away, or they'll put you in a cage, or worse, they'll take your life. Even if you comply with the edicts, these men with guns often take people's lives. So something I've been interested in exploring is what types of institutions can we create that can help overcome that fear, to where we can live our lives in a manner that's consistent with our personal philosophy, not that's consistent with Representative Lloyd Doggett here in Austin, Texas, or whoever happens to be the President of the United States. So Bitcoin came along, and I was already interested in exploring alternative institutions in these various areas, from healthcare to defense to justice to food production. We did live on a 2.4 acre farmstead. We now have a friend that lives on a farm. We grow our own food, and we're interested in aquaponics and all that stuff. So when Bitcoin came along, or when I was exposed to Bitcoin, which in large part was at Liberty Forum 2013 in New Hampshire, which is where Jeffrey was really exposed to Bitcoin and got turned on to Bitcoin. Dogecoin. Wasn't around back then. But Bitcoin was just like, wow, this is awesome. Here we have a living example that anarchy works. The idea that people can participate voluntarily with one another for mutual benefit without the need of some central planner or some central arbiter or some coercive institution to make sure everyone plays by the rules. And everyone's not playing by the rules. Mount Gox. but who knows what's going on with that. But I think it's exciting because for me, it's living proof. It's a demonstration. People say, oh, well, we could never live in a genuinely free society. Anarchism, that's just a pipe dream, right? Well, here's a demonstration of anarchy in action. Bitcoin. Look at all the people. Nobody was forced to come here today. Nobody was coerced into coming here today. People chose to do so of their own volition because they want to belong to a strong community of like-minded individuals. And people want to participate in a currency exchange, a medium of exchange that isn't dependent on the big banks. There's not some leech or some parasitic entity that's just taking value away from everyone or forcing people to fit into some small little box that they believe is the way we ought to live. So I'm so excited about the promise of that. And that's what originally turned me on about Bitcoin, the way that it undermines the state, because I'm vehemently anti-state, pro-liberty, pro-voluntary cooperation. I was excited about the opportunity to exchange value without having to rely on credit cards or the banks. And then when I actually that was how I initially was excited about it, right? This philosophy, the philosophical aspect of it. But then when I actually started using it, I operate a news service. It's called the Liberty Beat. It's a 5-minute daily top-of-the-hour news service like Fox News or NPR provides, except it has a liberty bent. It's liberty propaganda. And you can call it that. It's okay. And I pay all my people in Bitcoin. It's almost entirely operated on Bitcoin. And one of my writers, his name's Derek. He's here at the conference. Two of the voice talents are here, Justin and Jessica Armand. One of my writers, he lives in Houston. And he chooses to live his life as an agorist. It's a philosophy called agorism, which is the idea of revolutionary market anarchism, the idea that we ought to create alternative institutions and not rely on the state. It's essentially the strategy of not competing within the state through political channels, but competing with the state to create better institutions that don't operate on force or central planning, that are spontaneous and that are more natural, in my opinion. So he prefers not to have money go through the banks. He doesn't have a checking account. And he lives in Houston. I live in Austin. I live in San Marcos now. So it was kind of a conundrum. How am I going to pay this guy? For a while, I was mailing him cash in a little, Christmas card. But that's full of all sorts of risk. And then I said, hey, why don't I use Bitcoin? Give that a try. There was a couple times when I sent him money Western Union. And I decided I'll be the good proprietor of this business and I'll go ahead and eat the 7% fee that it was. And it was a pain in the butt. I had to drive my butt down to HEB. I have 2 kids. It's always difficult. So I said, hey, why don't I be consistent with my ideals and try Bitcoin? And as soon as I tried it, a couple clicks, he sent me his address. I actually encouraged him to set up the wallet. It's a great way to grow people in the ecosystem. If you own a business or if you're paying people, say, how about this? How about I pay you with Bitcoin? Maybe I'll pay you 5% more or something. You help them set up the wallet, and then you pay them with Bitcoin. It's a wonderful way to grow the Bitcoin ecosystem and grow the users of Bitcoin. But as soon as I used it the first time in an actual practical use, that's when I genuinely began to grasp the true value of Bitcoin, even more so than its role in undermining the state and demonstrating that anarchism works and undermining the central banks, just how easy it is to use. And people are kind of baffled by it, and yes, there is a little bit of a barrier to entry, but once you genuinely understand how to use Bitcoin, and once more people genuinely understand how easy Bitcoin is to use, I think it's going to be adopted worldwide, and it very well may replace just about every single, that's right, very well may replace just about every single fiat currency that there is out there, and I think it's very promising. And now at this conference, I'm learning more about Bitcoin 2.0, and the idea that we could form contracts, and the idea that we could have decentralized rideshare programs. Like in Austin, for example, they had one of these little apps that was started. It was a startup. How great, it's great for the economy, it's great for the environment, it's great for people's bottom lines. They could share a ride and help each other out. Well, of course, the taxi cartel that operates through the Austin City Council shut the app down. Well, at the hackathon, there's a team working on this decentralized peer-to-peer rideshare program that you can't shut down. There's nothing to shut down. It exists in the blockchain. It's awesome. The promise of that is promising, and I'm really excited about it. You could even go so far as to use the Bitcoin protocol, the blockchain, or Mastercoin in order to create our own voluntary forms of government. We can all unite. We can have our little token and we could vote using the blockchain as well. And we could say, well, I want to participate voluntarily with this group of 1,000 people. We can all decide once we reach a consensus to do A, B, or C task, we're going to move forward with it. You can even say, well, if everybody agrees to do A, B, or C, we're going to put $20 in. And if not everyone agrees to execute it, then that $20 isn't going to be used. we're forming something that we call Freedom Cells, which is like a decentralized mutual aid society. Start with a group of 10 people, dedicate yourself to one another, help each other out, try to form another group of 8 to 12 people. When you have 8 to 12 groups of 8 to 12, now you have about 80 to 120 people that dedicate themselves to one another and help each other out. You get 8 to 12 groups of 80 to 120, now you have around 1,000 people. Well, what if you could say, all right, if everyone chips in $20 when our friend here breaks his leg, we can all help provide for his health care. We don't need to rely on Obamacare or this centralized health care scheme. We can take care of one another. And when I think about that in association with utilizing Bitcoin, the sky truly is the limit. And I feel truly blessed to be here on the ground floor with a wonderful movement of people. And I think the potential that Bitcoin has to genuinely free the world. There's a saying, free the market and free the world. I think we're living it. And I want to thank everyone for coming out and participating in that. And go Bitcoin, 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 Bitcoin. All right.
I want to take a sec to thank some of the sponsors that make this program possible. I want to thank Central Texas Gun Works. You can find them at centraltexasgunworks.com. They were the first gun store in the entire country to take that leap and start accepting Bitcoin. And you can purchase firearms, accessories, CHL courses if you're here in Central Texas, self-defense training. You could purchase it all online at centraltexasgunworks.com. They also happen to be one of the first places, definitely the first gun store in the country, to have a Bitcoin ATM. So if you're in the Central Texas area, you want to go buy or sell some Bitcoin, you can go down to 321 West Ben White Boulevard, number 203. That's in Austin, Texas, 78704, deep in the heart of South Austin. And you can use their Bitcoin ATM right there. Again, that's Central Texas Gun Works. You can find them online, and you could purchase firearms and firearms accessories at centraltexasgunworks.com, or you can head on in to 321 West Ben White Boulevard, number 203, if you're here in Central Texas, and use their fancy Bitcoin ATM. I mean, what's better than guns and Bitcoin? That's right, folks. I also want to thank our other sponsor, Bitmain, bitmaintech.com. They are a very reputable mining hardware manufacturer. They're the ones that brought you the Antminer S1, which is currently selling for 0.938 BTC. It'll bring you 180 gigahash, 360 watts. And then you got the Antminer S2, which is coming out soon. That's a 1 terahash machine. And that's only 1,000 watts for that 1 terahash, which is essentially equivalent to what the Cointera machines are doing. That is the Antminer S2. You could purchase those for $3,600, and they will ship out on April 10th. So it's an opportunity to get some pretty serious hashing power, not have to wait for a pre-order that you won't get for 3, 4, 5 months. Perhaps it's delayed. Again, that's Antminer S2 1 terahash machine. That's 1 watt per gigahash, which is pretty exciting for the technology now. You can find that at bitmaintech.com. I want to thank them for the support of the Sovereign BTC podcast. Well, we're going to bring you our quote of the week. This one's a little bit interesting this week. We're actually going to read Mr. Dorian Nakamoto's statement that he and his attorney recently put out to the world regarding the Newsweek article that pinned him as Satoshi Nakamoto himself, the creator of Bitcoin. I, for one, think it's hogwash. I think it was shoddy journalism. It's possible that this gentleman is, in fact, Satoshi Nakamoto, the Satoshi Nakamoto. If it is, then he is one heck of an actor, and he must have taken some acting training because he's done little things like say, I've never worked for that company, the Bitcoin company, as if there was a company, a central company behind Bitcoin. He called it Bitcom even, which he talks about here in the statement. But I wanted to go ahead and read his statement. I want to stand in solidarity with Dorian Satoshi Nakamoto. I think he's having a really rough time, and as we'll reveal here in the statement, he actually recently had prostate surgery, and he suffered a stroke. So he's having a rough time recovering from all that, and along comes this Newsweek reporter that seemed to just make his life a living hell. So without further ado, here's this week's quote of the week. It's a statement from Dorian Satoshi Nakamoto. My name is Dorian Satoshi Nakamoto. I'm the subject of the Newsweek story on Bitcoin. I'm writing this statement to clear my name. I did not create, invent, or otherwise work on Bitcoin. I unconditionally deny the Newsweek report. The first time I heard the term Bitcoin was from my son in mid-February 2014. After being contacted by a reporter, my son called me and used the word which I had never before heard. Shortly thereafter, the reporter confronted me at my home. I called the police. I never consented to speak with the reporter. In an ensuing discussion with a reporter from the Associated Press, I called the technology Bitcom. I was unfamiliar with the term. My background is in engineering. I also have the ability to program. My most recent job was an electrical engineer troubleshooting air traffic control equipment for the FAA. I have no knowledge of, nor have I ever worked on cryptography, peer-to-peer systems, or alternative currencies. I've not been able to find steady work as an engineer or programmer for 10 years. I've worked as a laborer, poll taker, and substitute teacher. I discontinued my internet service in 2013 due to the severe financial distress. I'm trying to recover from prostate surgery in October 2012 and a stroke I suffered in October of 2013. My prospects for gainful employment has been harmed because of the Newsweek article. Newsweek's false report has been the source of a great deal of confusion and stress for myself, my 93-year-old mother, my siblings, and their families. I offer my sincerest thanks to those people in the United States and around the world who have offered me their support. I've retained legal counsel. This will be our last public statement on this matter. I ask that you now respect our privacy. Dorian Satoshi Nakamoto, Temple City, California, March 17th, 2014. Well, my hat goes off to you, Dorian, and I'm sorry if you are not, in fact, Satoshi Nakamoto. I'm sorry that you're going through living hell due to some shoddy Newsweek journalism, perhaps aimed at restoring some cred for them or getting their name back out there. I know that their print edition, they weren't able to do it because they were running out of money, not really doing too good of a job like many mainstream media outlets are, so who knows their motivation behind that, but I do know it was shoddy journalism, and as a result of it, somebody's life has been harmed. That's very unfortunate, and kudos to you, Dorian Satoshi Nakamoto, for putting this statement out there and clearing the air. Next, we're going to bring you this week's featured speech. Sometimes we do featured interviews, sometimes we do featured speeches. I was at the Texas Bitcoin Conference recently and recorded quite a few speeches, and we'll be bringing them to you sparingly throughout the life of the SovereignBTC podcast. We also have one with Vitalik Buterin we want to bring to you soon as well on Ethereum. This one was all about Austrian economics and Bitcoin, and Dr. Robert Murphy, who's with the Mises Institute, he did a good job of really summing up some of the critiques that the Austrian school has with Bitcoin, and he offered some replies to those critiques. Gets really in-depth. It's a rather wonky speech, but I think you'll appreciate it. Dr. Murphy's a funny guy as well, so he could take something as dry as economics, which they call the dismal science, and make it entertaining and fun. I think there's a lot of people in the Bitcoin world that are techies and that are into money, but a lot of people, even finance, but a lot of people fail to grasp the underlying economics, the root, the heart of what Bitcoin's all about. And I think Dr. Robert Murphy gives a good overview of an Austrian economist's understanding of Bitcoin. I may not 100% agree with everything that the Austrian school has to say on Bitcoin, but as he points out towards the end of the speech, perhaps Mises, Ludwig von Mises, who was a 19th century Austrian economist who founded the Austrian school, essentially, along with Karl Menger before him. He points out that perhaps Mises wasn't able to predict that this type of technology would exist because it defies some of the central tenets of the Austrian school of economics. But I'll let Dr. Robert Murphy get into those details. Without further ado, folks, here's Dr. Robert Murphy giving a speech at the Texas Bitcoin Conference on Bitcoin and Austrian economics.
It's always good to be at a conference like this and reassure myself that my Facebook friends actually exist in real life, so I'm glad to see many of you. And what I'm going to do, let me just explain the scope of my talk. So I am an economist coming from the tradition of what's called the Austrian School of Economics. And what I'm going to do... Okay, very good. Can we get a clap for liberty? No. Now I won the crowd over. Okay, what I want to talk about as I was trying to figure out what could I give to this group that maybe another speaker wouldn't be giving you, because obviously there's a lot of people here who know more about the mechanics of Bitcoin than I do, and I'm coming at this as an economist who was a former college professor and so forth. So I think what I can do with this group is I want to make sure you understand why it is, because I'm sure many of you have noticed this, that there's a bit of a pushback from some in the Austro-libertarian community where you normally would probably expect that they would be huge proponents of Bitcoin and all currencies more generally, and yet there's this vehement hostility to it coming from certain quarters, and in particular citing what's called Ludwig von Mises' regression theorem. Okay, so my goal in this talk is to very quickly just distill down the elements of Austrian economics, and in particular its treatment of monetary theory, that you would need to know so that you at least understand where they're coming from, right? Because I think there's two things going on in terms of that hostility. One is just human nature, that you got 1,000 different things libertarians are trying to sort of beat back the state, and so if Bitcoin ends up working, or the things in this genre start working, and other people were naysaying in the beginning, well, then they feel silly, and so that sort of reinforces that. So there's nothing you can do about that. If it's just not the horse that they put their money on, they're always going to be bitter about it. But it's more than just that. There really is a reason, and what you'll see it once I explain it to you, why it is that people coming out of the Austrian tradition of economics and the way Austrians explain monetary theory, why Bitcoin just came out of left field. And it takes someone from that background a while to just get their head wrapped around what Bitcoin even is and how it could be possible. And so that's what I want you to see. So especially because I know there's a lot of you in here who are sort of like Bitcoin evangelists, and I want you to understand so you can at least know how to approach these people and try to argue with them and see where they're coming from. Okay, so to do that, I'm going to need to explain three pieces, two things that Carl Menger contributed to economics, and then one thing that came from Mises. And then when I give you those three things, you'll be in a position to really, like I say, it'll be obvious to you why there's this hostility from certain quarters against Bitcoin. All right, so Carl Menger is the founder of what's called the Austrian School of Economics. In case you don't know that phrase, it's not that they study the GDP in Vienna. The reason it's called Austrian economics is just that historically that's where these people happen to be from. It was actually a term of derision that the German historical school economists were just dismissing these guys in the 1870s and saying, oh, that's just Austrian economics, because Germany was the center there, and these guys in Austria it was just a backwater. So that's where the name came from, and it's stuck. So Carl Menger in the early 1870s wrote a book that we now translate as The Principles of Economics, and that was the foundation of what we now call the Austrian School. So Carl Menger did all sorts of things. Two things that we need to know for what I'm trying to get across tonight is his explanation for the origin of money, and then also what's called subjective value theory. All right, so the origin of money, and this is not just that Austrians go to Carl Menger. He actually crystallized the way professional economists in the late 1800s dealt with the origin of money. He actually wrote the encyclopedia entry for the relevant periodical on this topic. Okay, so he was the authority. It's not just that today's Austrians look back to him because he's their guy. Everyone thought he was the guy for this topic. So the first thing that Menger does is he explodes what might be called the state theory of money. So there was a prevailing view, just like we see today, where people kind of just assume that if something useful socially exists, it must have been consciously created by somebody or some group, and probably that they had political authority. And and you see that that pattern today. Whenever there's an issue, the catchphrase, "Oh, there ought to be a law," right? Or whenever there's some kind of social problem, a lot of people, the knee-jerk reaction is, "Well, the government ought to do X, Y, and Z to deal with that." Well, that also was true among professional economists in certain sects, that they thought, well, clearly money is useful, and so therefore some wise king or something in the past must have invented it. And so Menger just walked through and critiqued and said, well, no, that doesn't really make sense. For one thing, we don't have a record of that, right? It's not that there was some guy, maybe called Eddie Money, who invented this thing, and then now that's his legacy. You would think, we have all kinds of things about Hammurabi, giving law and so forth, and things that these rulers did. You'd think the guy who invented money, we might remember him, and there is no such record. All right, so he's saying that's one strike against it. So the other thing is, if you hadn't grown up in a society using money, it's kind of a crazy idea, right? Imagine if you grew up in a society where people were just bartering, and then somebody comes along and says, hey, instead of trading for stuff that you actually want, why don't you trade away your valuable stuff for something you really don't want to use at all? But as long as we can all agree to do that, then it'll be fine, because you'll get something else. Let's grab this shell. Nobody likes these shells for anything, but give me your cow for this shell, and don't worry, because whatever you actually want to get, that person will take the shell as well. Right? That sounds crazy. That idea, if you've never experienced money firsthand, it sounds like a nutty idea, even though now in hindsight we realize that using money is actually very productive. Another problem that Menger pointed out was to say, even if some wise king or some smart intellectual sage dreamt up the idea, of using money when they had no firsthand experience with it, how would you know what its purchasing power should be? So even if you could get everyone to agree, oh yeah, it would be better if instead of us trading things directly for what we want, we all agree to sell our stuff for these shells, let's say, and then we'll go use the shells to buy whatever it is that we need. So there'll be like a middle step in the transaction. Even if we could all agree that that's a sensible way to proceed, how would you know how much stuff a given shell could buy, what its purchasing power would be? That also would be completely arbitrary. And so that not only would the king have to sell everybody on the idea of using money, he would also have to lay down what the exchange ratios were, like how many shells for a horse, how many shells for a cow, and so forth, right? So Menger was just walking through and trying to get to see the enormity of the problem, that it's not obvious. How could you go from a state of not using money to a position of using money without assuming some superhuman intellect along the way and then a lot of force backing it up? So what Menger then gave, so that seems like, you knocked it down, but then what's the solution? He almost makes it look like it's an impossible problem. And what Menger gave, and he didn't invent it out of whole cloth. You can see versions of this even in Adam Smith, but Menger kind of crystallized it and explained it really logically, is he gave a step-by-step account of how people starting in barter could end up using money, even though at no point was that anybody's intention, that nobody consciously said, let's try to move society so that 10 years from now we're all using money, that no one had any goal like that in mind. They were just doing what was in their immediate self-interest, and yet the spontaneous product of those efforts was the creation of what we now call money. All right, so in the interest of time, I'm going to boil it down really quickly for you. Imagine, so I'm going to make an exaggerated scenario, but just to get the idea, the logic of the argument. So Menger's saying, imagine we have a state of barter. There's no money. We just trade things directly against each other, useful commodities. He said, even in that situation, some would be more marketable than others. There would be certain commodities that lots of people would use, like sugar and flour and bread and eggs, where there'd be other commodities that would not have a very big market on any given day. So imagine somebody who makes like telescopes, like really fancy, intricate telescopes. That's his business, okay, and then he wants to go sell that, and he needs to get eggs and milk and all sorts of sweaters and all sorts of things for his household. In a state of barter, he would have to go out and find one other person who had that whole array of goods that he was looking for, that he wanted to go to market to obtain, and that person was looking for the exact kind of telescope that he was bringing to market that day. Okay, so you can see the odds of that happening, of those two sorts of people meeting up, are vanishingly small, and that's what economists call the problem of the double coincidence of wants, that under barter, you need to, if you have something you want to sell and you have something you want to buy, you have to find someone with the reverse valuations, or else the trade won't go through. So Menger said clearly what an obvious solution to that is, or a stepping stone, is the person going to market with the telescope. Even if he can't find someone who has exactly the array of goods that he's looking for, that's his point in going to market that day, let's say he finds someone who wants the telescope, and that person's willing to give him a good that's far more marketable than the telescope is. Because the telescope, even though it's valuable, it's very illiquid, to use more modern terminology. So Menger would have said it's unsaleable, that it's hard to sell. Okay, it doesn't mean it's got low value, right? There's a distinction there. Just like a house is very valuable, but a house is very illiquid. Okay, whereas a $10 bill is not nearly as valuable as a house, but it's very liquid. Okay, so that's a distinction. Same thing, the telescope could be really valuable, but very illiquid or unmarketable. So an obvious solution is if he finds just somebody who's willing to buy the telescope and give him stuff that's in the proper range of value in terms of market exchange, but yet is more liquid than the telescope, then he'll go ahead and do that. All right, so let's say he finds someone who has a bunch of flour and is willing to give him lots of sacks of flour for the telescope. So he would do that, not because he wants to go home with that many sacks of flour, but because he realizes I can use the flour then and then trade and get the stuff that I ultimately want. Okay, because there's more people out there on any given day who want flour than who want a telescope like this. Okay, so that's the logic of the argument. And then once you get over that little hump, then the rest is obvious, that from the initial state of where some goods were more marketable just because more people wanted to use them directly, that it would be a snowball effect. So now this guy going to market who maybe didn't want flour at all, he would be willing to accept it in trade, knowing, well, I can unload this more easily than that telescope. Okay, so now there's one more person in the community who's willing to accept flour. Okay, so things that had an initial advantage in marketability, it gets multiplied. And so the term for that is a medium of exchange. So a medium of exchange by itself isn't money. It just means something that you're willing to accept, not because you want it directly, but because you plan on trading it away to get something else. Okay, so then where does money come from? Well, Menger just said, well, this process would snowball over time, and things that were initially a little bit more marketable, more people would accept because of that fact. It would multiply, and then eventually, if you got to a point where there were one or a few commodities that everybody in the community would accept as a medium of exchange, that's what money is. Okay, and then so being money is just an empirical, it's a question of degree, whereas a medium of exchange, that's like a qualitative difference. Okay, if you accept something not because you want to use it yourself, but because you plan on trading away, that's what makes it a medium of exchange. But if it's money, it just means, is this thing a medium of exchange for enough people in the relevantly defined community that it's universally acceptable? Then that's what makes it money. So all money is a medium of exchange, but not all media of exchange are money. Okay, then to explain why historically were some things monies and others not, there were a few principles that would make for a good money. So if something was durable, easily divisible, homogeneous in terms of smaller divisible parts, things like that would, a convenient market exchange value for its weight, things like that would make for a good money. And so that's why like cattle aren't very good actually, because they're hard to maintain, they're hard to move around, they go to the bathroom, that sort of thing, right? So even though cattle in certain places was money, that's not why in 1850 the merchants around the world were using cattle as money, because that's inefficient. The reason gold and silver were the monies par excellence is because they were good on all of those dimensions. So let me just quickly walk through. So you might wonder, well, how come diamonds didn't become money, even though in many respects diamonds are kind of like gold? Well, because it's not that a pound of diamonds is the same as a pound of diamonds, right? If you have one huge diamond that's a pound, that's more valuable than a bunch of tiny little diamonds that collectively weigh a pound. Whereas with gold, that's not true. If you have a pound of gold and a pound of gold, unless it happens to be like in an antique coin or something, you could just melt it down and then you do whatever you want with it. So a pound of gold or silver is a pound of gold or silver, again, except for numismatic value. Whereas that's not true for diamonds or emeralds and things like that. You might say, okay, well, how come bronze or platinum didn't become money? How come gold and silver? Well, just because the vagaries of exchange and convenience, gold and silver were good. That for big purchases, gold coins were convenient, and for smaller purchases, silver coins were convenient in terms of how much weight of metal in your pocket, whereas bronze, you would have needed to be carrying around too much weight for the transactions you wanted to do. And for metals that were rarer than gold, it was the opposite problem, that it was too small, that you'd have to dilute it too much for a given coin. Otherwise, you'd only use it very rarely. Okay, so that's Menger's story for how money would have emerged spontaneously from a state of barter. Okay. And so notice in that explanation, nobody ever sat around saying we really have to work hard to create money because that will help everybody. It just spontaneously happened. So you can see why libertarians like that kind of a story, right? That it didn't take any central planner. It just spontaneously happened. Everyone working in his own interest. And also why, objectivists would like that kind of story. Okay, the other contribution that Menger gave was what's called marginal subjective value theory. And that overturned the classical economist approach that relied on the cost theory. Now, we're running low on time here, and so I want to get to the meat of this and the Bitcoin issue. So really quickly, the classical economists tended to explain relative prices in the market by the cost of production. And so, just loosely speaking, if you said, how come a bottle of champagne has such a high price, they would say, well, the land on which the grapes are grown and so forth is really expensive, and so it costs a lot to make that thing, so they have to be able to charge enough to cover their costs. With Menger's approach, it flipped it on its head and said, no, the reason a bottle of champagne has a high market value is people like to drink it. It gives them utility, and one more bottle of champagne gives them a lot of happiness, and that's why it has a high market price. And because of that, the people who grow the grapes that are needed to make that stuff are willing to pay a lot for that particular land, and so they can bid away that land from potential other uses. And so it's the other way around, that it's the high price of the champagne that makes the cost of production end up being higher. Right? But ultimately, it's subjective consumer valuations of the object that is the source of its value in the marketplace. So it's not anything objective. It's not a feature out there. It's in the human mind. Right? So that's subjective value theory, and that is the modern explanation of market prices. So that's not just an Austrian thing. It's just Menger happened to be one of the pioneers in that, who's also happened to be an Austrian economist. Okay, but ironically, perhaps, even though that swept the field, economists use that approach to explain relative prices, like why a horse would trade for so many barrels of marmalade or something like that in terms of relative values. But to explain the purchasing power of money, they didn't use subjective value theory because they thought they would be arguing in a circle. So let me just try to get you to see this, and then you'll understand what Mises solved. And then we'll be finally where we need to be so you understand where Bitcoin comes in. All right? So I get my students to pay attention because I know I'm going to quiz them, but you guys just bear with me here. All right. Okay, so the problem, so like I said, economists across the board embraced what was called subjective value theory. They realized the old classical approach of a cost theory of value was wrong. There was lots of problems with that. The subjective value theory could explain everything. It was great. But they thought the one area where it didn't really make sense or it seemed kind of superfluous was explaining the purchasing power of money. So let me just boil it down for you. If I say, why is it that this teenager is willing to sell an hour of his labor for a $10 bill, the subjective value theory would say, oh, because he subjectively values getting that $10 bill more than his hour of leisure. And you say, okay, but why does he value that $10 bill? It's just a green piece of paper. He can't eat it. It's not very useful for much. You say, oh, well, because he can go buy stuff with it. That's why he values it. So it looks like you're just arguing in a circle. It looks like you're saying the reason a $10 bill can buy things like an hour of labor is that a $10 bill can buy things. And so, I could just as well, that explanation could just as well explain why he would sell his labor for a $1,000 bill if the stuff he wanted to buy, in the market was roughly comparable to his hour of labor, right? So the subjective value theory seemed like it explained relative prices, like why an hour of labor would trade for so many cans of Coke, but it didn't seem like it would explain the actual absolute value of dollars, let's say, all right? So Mises was the one who explained that element of the problem. And he said, no, you got to bring the time element into it, that really what's going on when you sell an hour of labor or anything in general right now for money, it's because you have an expectation of the future purchasing power of money, right? You're expecting money now because you think when you spend it down the road, it will be able to buy some stuff. So you're explaining the current purchasing power of money by reference to expectations of its future ones. So there's a little bit of a time element involved. And so then the economist said, well, wait a minute, Mises, though, okay, you're right, it's not a circular argument, but now it's just an infinite regress. You're basically saying the reason money has purchasing power today is that people yesterday thought it was going to have purchasing power, or they had some expectations of what it was going to be yesterday. All right, and so it's, where do we get our expectations of what the $10 bill is going to buy? The teenager, it's because he has recently been to the store and saw it with his own eyes what a $10 bill buys. Okay, so Mises kind of split it up and said, loosely speaking, yesterday the teenager saw what a $10 bill could buy, so today he sells an hour of labor for a $10 bill because he expects tomorrow he has a good idea of what a $10 bill can buy. So it's like tomorrow's purchasing power ultimately gets explained by yesterday's purchasing power. So the economist said, well, Mises, you're just arguing an infinite regress. How do you explain yesterday's purchasing power? Well, you'd have to go to the day before. And then they threw their hands up. And then Mises said, no. It wouldn't go back infinitely. So it's true. My story says ultimately today's purchasing power is based on yesterday's. Yesterday's is ultimately based on the day before, and so on. But it's not infinite. There's a definite stopping point when we get back to the original state of barter. Because Menger has already shown us how you go from barter to the emergence of money. And so Mises is saying what I'm telling you is right now, using subjective value theory, I can explain the purchasing power of money by reference to our knowledge of yesterday's prices, and we could go back step by step, ultimately to barter, because Menger's shown us how to get out of that trap. And once we're in barter, we don't have this issue of a circular argument. We already know, we all agree as economists, how to explain barter prices, because that's just relative prices. Okay, so that is that's the way I would have taught this stuff to my students back when I was a college professor. That's the way writing up study guides for Austrian economics. That's what I would give. All right. So now I hope you guys can see at least the issue of where Bitcoin comes in. It looks like that shouldn't be possible, and you'll see many people literally say, "Well, no, Mises showed that in order for something to be a money, it must have first served as a commodity." Oh, by the way, in case you're concerned, one of the you say, "Well, what about the fiat money, government fiat money, like dollars and euros and stuff?" Was never used as a commodity. So how did Mises explain that? Well, he would say that was historically, those were redeemable in gold and silver. So it's not that some group of people just started using unbacked U.S. dollars. It's historically was tied to gold, and that link was severed. So that's how people had the connection. So it's not a moralistic or a fairness argument. It's an argument about people need to know what the purchasing power is in order to get off the ground. That's kind of where the argument is. So a lot of people say, well, Bitcoin can never become money because of this issue. So we're getting close here where we want to switch to Q&A. So let me just offer some of the things I've said in this debate on this topic, and then I'll turn it over to you guys, and maybe Q&A will get further along. So one thing I pointed out to people is I said, you got to be really careful. You're going to end up making Mises look like an idiot, because if you say, like I said, I'm not putting words in people's mouth. People literally will say, and I'm sure many of you have seen this on the internet, that Bitcoin can never become money. Yeah, sure, right now a small group of people use it, but it will never be a widely accepted money because of the Mises regression theorem. And I was pointing out, that's not a good argument. You're misunderstanding it. If Mises is right and has something relevant to say against Bitcoin, it can't be a medium of exchange. Because whether something's a medium of exchange turned into money, that's just an empirical, quantitative matter of how many people are using it. The decisive thing is someone willing to accept it to then go buy something else with it. And in Mises' actual words, in the Theory of Money and Credit, the book where he developed this, he says stuff like, it is unthinkable that something could serve as a medium of exchange without having previously been in use as a regular commodity that was not valued for those reasons. Okay, so it's Mises himself who puts the crux of the matter on whether it could be a medium of exchange. Whether it's a money is just a detail after that point. So I'm pointing out to people, Bitcoin, and I was actually at a conference one time, and a guy who was of this mindset said something like, he made a real sweeping statement like, well, no, right now people just use Bitcoin to get other currencies. No one actually buys real goods and services with Bitcoin. And some 18-year-old in the crowd said, well, I do. And he was good about it. He was cool about it. He just went, oh. And then we just moved on. Like, it's economist admits he was wrong, page 1. But so that was good. But so that's part of it. So that's the lie. So I trying to walk people through and say, just be really careful if you want to hold up Mises as this guru on this matter, that the way you guys are framing it, he already is demonstrably wrong. So I think you want to recalibrate the argument. So it wouldn't be an issue of could it ever evolve into money. So clearly we see that Bitcoin is already out there serving as a medium of exchange. And again, in case you're losing the terminology, just meaning people will sell valuable stuff like bicycles and software and T-shirts in exchange for Bitcoin, knowing full well that they're going to use that Bitcoin to acquire other things later. Okay, and so it already is serving as a medium of exchange, so there's clearly no issue about it. It can't be impossible. If you're thinking Mises proved it was impossible, then Mises was wrong because it already happened. So then the other issue for what I've done in trying to talk with people, people coming from this mindset, is to try to understand, okay, is it that Mises was wrong, that he just overlooked something, or is there some way we can reconcile it? So if you want to try to reconcile it, you could do it like this, and I've seen some people try to say it, people who are fans of Bitcoin and fans of living on Mises and his regression theorem, and they say, well, no, it was serving as a useful commodity valued beyond its just ability to serve as a medium of exchange, because the early adopters knew that if this thing takes off, it will challenge the state's hegemony or something like that, and so they were valuing it. There's a little kick in there. So that was partly why they were accepting it, is because they saw the future. And so they weren't just valuing it as a medium of exchange, right? So that's that's one way to try to work it in. Just like gold and silver were valued as jewelry before people started accepting them as a medium of exchange. By the same token, they're saying people, would have just intrinsically valued Bitcoin for ideological reasons. Okay, so that's one sort of escape hatch. My leading, and this is the last point I'll make here and turn over to your guys' questions, I think we should just admit that Mises didn't conceive of this possibility. Because in practice, again, not to throw him under the bus, and you can see where he's coming from, it is odd. Remember the problem with the shells and Menger's critique of the idea that some king just woke up one day and invented money out of thin air. Again, one of the arguments against that was to say, well, how would anybody know how much purchasing power it should have? That's kind of weird. But actually what happened historically with Bitcoin is in the beginning it had virtually zero purchasing power, but it wasn't exactly zero. And so I don't think anyone ever conceived of that you might get people to adopt something not having any experience with what its purchasing power was if it was so cheap that in the grand scheme of things, yeah, sure, I'll take that, and I'll take 1,000 of these for a pizza, whatever, because it's not a big deal to give up one pizza for this stuff. And then if that was just the genesis to then give us some framework for how do we know what its purchasing power, then it's off to the races. So in my mind, you could bend over backwards and try to say, well, no, that fits into what Mises, but I think it's just easier to say he didn't conceive of that possibility, that it could start out with a really low purchasing power that then mushroomed over time. Actually, I lied. One more thing I want to say, again, in terms of you guys understanding the hesitance or the resistance. Again, part of the appeal of the Mengerian story was nobody had to invent money. It wasn't that they sat around scratching their heads and agonizing over it. There weren't conferences to get people to start using gold as money. It just happened spontaneously. And so a lot of Austro-libertarians think it's weird when they read stuff like, after the Mt. Gox goes down, and I saw some people writing, real heartfelt reactions and saying things like, okay, guys, this isn't the end. We just got to regroup and let's not give up. This is, this thing will work. We just got to think it through. And so a lot of libertarians look at that and say, it shouldn't be this hard. That, you shouldn't have to plan this, and it just strikes them as icky, like, oh, we're central planners. Okay, so I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I just want you to understand the emotional, why that seems odd to them. And so for a lot of people, they don't understand this. Okay, so I'll stop there and turn over to questions.
Well, we hope you enjoyed this week's program. Thank you so much for your support. I want to give another shout out to Let's Talk Bitcoin, Let's Talk Bitcoin Network, everything they're doing. Really excited about LTBcoin and can't wait to be a part of that. I think it's a wonderful decentralized application utilizing the Bitcoin blockchain, a DAC as they call it, or perhaps this would also be a distributed autonomous organization. Really excited to be a part of that and looking forward to learning more from Adam Levine and everyone that's helping out on that project. Check out letstalkbitcoin.com to hear my podcast and more if you want to get your rocks off when it comes to everything Bitcoin. I want to invite you to check out SovereignBTC.com to learn more about this operation and also to check out our podcast feed, which has excerpts from the program as well as full-length speeches that I've recorded at various Liberty and Bitcoin conferences throughout the country. Like us on Facebook at Facebook.com/SovereignBTC. Follow us on Twitter at Twitter.com/SovBTC. And remember, use Bitcoin, live free, and prosper.